I finally snapped at her and shouted, "It's none of your damn business." I stormed out of the house with a pounding headache, mad at the world. I drove to Starbucks that day. It seemed too far to go by bike. Inside, I was irate to see a line reaching the bathroom. I stood there fidgeting, glaring at everyone else in line. I couldn't understand why they had to be there, taking their time. I wanted to push them out of the way when they couldn't decide what to order.
Listen, we all talk about the grind, but most of you are subsidizing your hustle with a chemical loan you can't pay back. In this new series, Unwired, we aren't just talking theory. We're going into the dirt with 40 anonymous stories of people who thought they were using caffeine to be superheroes, only to realize it was the very thing dismantling their health and their marriages. This is the case study of the hidden tax on your ambition. Welcome back to Live Unwired. I'm Al Kushner, and this is the podcast where real people pull back the curtain on one of the most socially accepted, widely ignored addictions on the planet, caffeine. And today's confession, I need you to really listen to this one, because out of everything we've covered so far, this might be the one that hits closest to home for most people. Not because it's the most dramatic, not because it ends badly, but because it could be anybody's story. It could be yours. Here's what I want you to think about for a second. When did you start drinking coffee or soda or energy drinks? Was it a choice you made, a real, conscious, informed choice? Or did someone just hand it to you one day and it felt rude to say no? A mentor, a coworker, a parent, a friend at Starbucks, a secretary passes cups around the conference table. That's how it happens. That's how it almost always happens. Not with a warning label, not with a conversation about what you're actually putting in your body. Just, here, have a cup. You look like you could use one. Today's confession is about a young woman who walked into her first classroom full of fire. She had her degree. She had her lesson plans. She had her whole future mapped out in front of her. And on the worst day of her first week, exhausted, overwhelmed, barely holding it together, her mentor sat her down, closed the door, and said those 4 words that changed everything. Let me get coffee. That was it. That was the moment. 1 cup in a messy classroom after the worst day of her young career. And from that single moment, everything unraveled, slowly, socially, and completely invisibly, until she was 3 pots deep a day, smoking cigarettes outside of Starbucks, watching the teaching career she was born for disappear in the rearview mirror. And the whole time, nobody flagged it, nobody intervened, because every single environment she walked into, the school, the teacher's lounge, the tech office, the bookstore, had coffee waiting for her. Society didn't just allow the addiction. Society built it. Cup by cup, break by break, corner Starbucks by corner Starbucks. She was hooked by design. And it wasn't until a doctor placed her hand on her own body and said the word drug, not habit, not vice, not weakness, drug, that she finally understood what had been happening to her all along. This confession is going to make you look at that cup in your hand very differently. Let's get into it.
The society trap. I never thought I had a problem. I mean, you read about every kind of addict, alcohol, drugs, or sex. I used to flip through various magazines reading about these accounts of people who suffered from addiction, how they lost everything, family, friends, and jobs. I read these stories while sipping my morning coffee and thought about how lucky I was to be so grounded in society. By my 5th cup of coffee, I would have read the entire magazine. My job was quite mentally demanding. For 2 years, I had been working as a kindergarten and 1st grade school teacher. Teaching was a path in life that I felt I was destined to take. I had received high marks at the university, and by the time I started my student teaching, I was ready to make a difference in the lives of children. Everything I had learned, the philosophy of teaching, methods, cognitive development, and classroom management were all at the forefront of my mind. What they didn't teach us in university, however, was that you could never be ready for what is thrown at you. My first week in school was one of those nightmare stories that you read about in a bad magazine. On the first day, my mentor was so busy that she could barely introduce herself. By day 2, she was absent, and I was thrown into full swing, not yet knowing all the kids. By the end of the week, I was trapped after school, getting creamed by an angry parent. Apparently, I had greatly hurt one of the children, whom I had called by the wrong name on my second day there. After I spent almost an hour trying to apologize, the woman gave me a break when she realized that I had made her late for a meeting. I turned around to face the empty classroom. Books were scattered across the floor, a bottle of glue had spilled all over the Spanish rug, and on my desk was a sea of ungraded papers, letters from parents, and a memo reminding me that I was supposed to be at a teachers' meeting an hour ago. When I took off down the hallway, I could already see the teachers leaving the meeting. They were all laughing and sharing stories about their first week. My mentor saw me and asked in a stern voice where I had been. That's when I lost it. The tears welled up and began pouring out before I even had a chance to turn around. In the midst of extreme embarrassment, I flew back into my classroom and buried my head in shame. My mentor came in and closed the door behind her. I felt the calming touch of her hand on my back. "So," she said, "your first week hasn't turned out to be quite what you were expecting." I just nodded as it was all that I could do. "My name's Janice, by the way. Janice Anderson, Mrs. Anderson." She shook my hand and finally welcomed me to her classroom. "Why don't I get us both a fresh cup of coffee, and then we can just sit here for a while and get to know each other? How do you take your coffee?" she asked. It sounds ridiculous, but I honestly had never drunk coffee until that moment. Of course, I had tried it before, but it never left much of a good impression. I hated the taste and just felt hyper and nervous afterward. But at that moment, with my shirt stained with tears and the events of the previous week still coursing through my veins, it sounded wonderful. Mrs. Anderson, as promised, brought 2 large cups of coffee back into our untidy classroom. I took mine black, as I didn't really have a preference, and she added just a pinch of sugar and a dash of powdered milk to hers. With the first sip, I felt better. Looking back, I don't think that I was responding to the taste or even the caffeine. It was the irresistible gesture of my mentor. It was someone throwing me a lifesaver in the midst of a hurricane. Coffee just happened to be a part of the scenery. We talked for over an hour while I told her about everything that had happened that week. She listened with empathy while I talked about feeling lost in the classroom. When I began to tell her about the angry parent, she insisted that we have another cup, and we went to the teacher's lounge. Angry parents are the worst, but they are sadly a reality of teaching that we all have to face, she said. Other teachers overheard what we were talking about, and they all came into the room with cups of coffee to exchange war stories. By the end of it all, I had met all the teachers and the principal, and I was feeling much more welcome. I used that first weekend to rest, reflect, and move on. On Monday, I arrived at school early and on time for the morning meeting. Mrs. Anderson sat next to me to discuss the week's lessons, my role, and so forth. When the school secretary passed around coffee, Mrs. Anderson yelled out that I took mine black. I didn't really want a cup at that point, but there was just too much activity going on for me to make a fuss. I thanked her and drank my cup. My second week was slightly smoother. I learned everyone's name, and I was completely in charge of the reading table. By the second half of the week, Mrs. Anderson put me in charge of the reading table and math and the science hour. You are going to need to develop a 3-week lesson plan for math and science, and remember to modify it for both kindergarten and first grade, and include modifications for all learner differences, she said. I nodded, writing this down for my weekend to-do list. You need all of this by tomorrow, she added. Whew. I stayed after school that night and worked until I had finished everything. By 10 p.m., I had fallen asleep on my desk. That next Friday, I was dragging myself through each hour, and when the kids were all packed up on the bus and papers were graded and the meeting adjourned, there was Mrs. Anderson with coffee. I sat down with her again, feeling much more confident than the week before, and now laughing about the first week with her. We drank a few cups between the two of us, and I remember feeling really excited to be cleaning up the classroom. Admittedly, it wasn't just the coffee boost. I was proud of myself for getting through another week, and the thought of the weekend was almost exhilarating. The weeks continued to go by with road bumps, small victories, and an occasional angry parent. All the while, coffee was becoming a greater part of it. I guess I had acquired a taste for it. I started to experiment with milk and sugar, and eventually learned that I like my coffee with lots of milk and lots of sugar. It became essential to have coffee every morning at school. I started to feel groggy in the mornings, which was strange for me because I'd always been a morning person. The school cup of coffee went from being something that I participated in if offered to something that I depended on. For a while, this was still just something that I associated with the school. I didn't have any at home since my mom always thought that it was poison, and my friends never drank any either. I certainly never thought that it was causing a problem. At that point, the school week was very hectic and filled with many coffee breaks, while the weekends were relaxing and coffee-free. In retrospect, and I say in retrospect because at that moment I still did not think that I had an addiction, the first sign of addiction came when I had to go to work without any coffee. As I said before, I never used to keep any coffee at home. My mom hated it, and she was already starting to comment on the new yellowish glow on my teeth. I was riding my bike to school on Monday morning to discover that Mrs. Anderson was ill and that I would be taking over the class that day. At that point, I felt much more comfortable in the classroom, but it still wasn't the best thing to hear on a Monday morning. My initial instinct was to grab a cup of coffee with lots of sugar, lots of milk. I should say how odd this was for me, as the majority of my life until that point had been coffee-free. I started to walk towards the teacher's room when the second-grade teacher came running up to me. "Can you stay here for a minute with Robert? He came early today and I have to meet with a parent." Before I had even agreed to do it, she was out of sight. 15 minutes later, I had a surge of panic, thinking about all the morning things that I had to do. I usually spend the first hour at the reading table while Mrs. Anderson did roll call, talked to parents, collected the Friday folders, and collected the lunch money before the kids had to be ready for their library hour. I saw the school lunch lady smoking outside and managed to get her attention. She wasn't happy about staying with Robert, but she grudgingly agreed to do it. With a spare moment to think, I tried to remember what I was about to do. The smell of coffee from the teacher's room worked like a nasty jolt to my system, and I again headed that way. Then the phone in our classroom started ringing. Mrs. Anderson had been very clear about the importance of answering the phone at all times. She had explained to me that usually only parents and teachers would call the classroom, and so we should always stop anything to answer the phone. So I did. It was a parent, an angry parent. The reason for her anger isn't important, but she was angry and she yelled. 20 minutes passed and she was still yelling. Teachers came in and out of the room wanting to talk to me. I couldn't get off the phone. Finally, when the kids started flooding into the room, I had to interrupt her and end the call. When I hung up, there were parents lined up outside the door wanting to talk to me about the new medicine that their child was on or which friend their child was going home with that day. The clock was already 10 minutes past the time we normally began lessons, and the kids were running all over the room. Finally, after the last parent left, I slammed the door and yelled as loudly as I could at the kids to sit down. They all stopped and stared at me stone-faced. I knew what they were thinking. I had never yelled like that before. At that moment, I didn't care. We had so much to do and my head was pounding. The day didn't get any better. If the kids asked me for help, I just told them to sit back down and keep trying. At the end of the day, I went to the teacher's lounge only to find that there was no more coffee. I was infuriated. I felt like they had planned it. I honestly imagined smacking the next person who approached me, but I didn't. Instead, I took a walk down the street to the local Starbucks. Until this point, coffee had still been something that I drank only at work. Until this point, I had never craved it at home. Up until this point, I never really thought that I had a problem. I certainly never thought that I had an addiction. But at that moment, the only thought I had was to get my hands on the largest, hottest cup of coffee filled with caffeine that I could find. The smell inside the Starbucks was exhilarating. The menu was exotic with so many flavors and options that I hadn't even known existed. I just stared up at the choices, overwhelmed with gluttony, like a child lost in a toy store. I ordered an extra tall cappuccino with extra sugar, and sitting down to that was like a shot of strong anesthetic at the doctor's office. It was delicious and so warm inside Starbucks. With every sip, my problems seemed to melt away. I got out a novel that I'd been dying to read but couldn't because of work. I sat there and read the first.
Quick pause for a second. If you're hearing yourself in this book, I built two things to go deeper than this audiobook can. First, there's Unwired, a caffeine cessation app where you can track your own withdrawal timeline, sleep, mood, and crashes day by day. And inside Unwired, you can work one-on-one with a coach who actually understands caffeine addiction and will walk you through a real plan instead of you guessing alone. The waitlist link is at the very top of the description. Second, there's the Unwired podcast, built around 40 real caffeine case studies, students, parents, founders, night shift workers, walking through the same crashes you're hearing about right now. The link is right next to the app. If you want more than information, if you actually want a plan, a coach, and stories that feel like yours, hit those links, then come right back.
6 chapters and then ordered another cappuccino and a piece of chocolate cake. Walking back to school to get my bike, pumped full of caffeine, I started to laugh away the day. I began ordering coffee every time I ate out in restaurants. Towards the end of my student teaching, I began to go to Starbucks every day after school and read there for hours. I had stopped giving 110% at school, but I didn't really see it as a problem because I was so close to finishing the student teaching position. I soon said goodbye to my students and Mrs. Anderson. I was going to miss them all, but I felt really good about moving on. I decided to take a few weeks off for myself before starting to look for jobs. I spent a lot of time at Starbucks catching up on all the reading I had missed during the student teaching. I started smoking occasionally, which was something I had sworn never to do, but since it was only something that I did when leaving Starbucks, I didn't think it was a problem. When a few weeks out of work became a few months, my mom really started to nag me. She had agreed to let me live with her while I did my student teaching, but she thought that it was unhealthy for me to be freeloading any longer. She continually asked me when I was going to find a job, why I was looking so unhealthy, and whether I was smoking. I finally snapped at her and shouted, "It's none of your damn business." I stormed out of the house with a pounding headache, mad at the world. I drove to Starbucks that day. It seemed too far to go by bike. Inside, I was irate to see a line reaching the bathroom. I stood there fidgeting, glaring at everyone else in line. I couldn't understand why they had to be there, taking their time. I wanted to push them out of the way when they couldn't decide what to order. When it was finally my turn, I snapped at the girl behind the register. "Give me an extra large coffee." The girl didn't look happy about my tone, but she held it in. "What kind of coffee would you like?" she asked. I lost my patience and snapped, "Just give me a coffee." At this point, people in line were staring at me, but I didn't care. I grabbed the coffee from the girl and stormed out into the cold, chugging it as fast as I could. I drove around looking for another Starbucks as I was too irritated to return to what I had once considered my haven away from school. When I found another one, I was slightly calmer and went through 3 more cups. By the end of it all, I was so wired and nervous that I could barely drive home. I was up to about 3 pots of coffee a day. I started keeping coffee at home. My mom wasn't happy about that. The mood swings continued. I couldn't feel motivated to look for a real job. I took a part-time job in a bookstore instead. I spent my days driving to work, drinking coffee, and reading. Pay was awful, but I was still living at home and made enough to support my habits. I used the plural form because I was now smoking on a regular basis. My friends weren't really around anymore because they had all started real jobs. I didn't care. If I felt angry or lethargic, I would just drink coffee and then laugh at it all. I could vent to the middle-aged hippies that I worked with and the part-time high school kids who came in after school. We would all drink coffee together and fill each other's heads with plans for the future. Maybe I'd be a writer. I loved to read, so it made sense. I'd often babble at work about the stories I would write. I'd tell myself that I'd go home and start writing, but it never happened. I'd go home to an angry mother who wondered what had happened to my teaching career. She was getting worried about me, and this made me angry. It was none of her business, I'd say, and by the time I would sit down to write, I was too fidgety, and my head would be swimming with incomprehensible thoughts. I started to feel sick on a regular basis, and when I couldn't finish a day of work, I finally decided to see a doctor. Sitting on the doctor's cold table, I couldn't help thinking that I really wanted to get a cup of coffee when it was over. Dr. H. smiled when he saw me. He was our family doctor, and he treated me my entire life. He started to ask about my family and teaching, and I was rolling my eyes. He said that the last time he saw me, I was at the university studying to be a teacher. I don't know why, but when he said this, my heart kind of sank. I just nodded my head and hoped that he wouldn't ask what I was doing now, but of course he did. The startling truth was that I lied. I told him that I was working as a reading specialist. I felt terrible, but I just couldn't bring myself to admit to him that after it all, I gave up. He told me to lie down on the table. Then he asked the usual questions and gave me a full exam. He asked if I give myself regular breast exams, and I said no. He said that I needed to be sure to check myself every month, and as he checked my breasts, he asked straight away if I had been consuming an unusual amount of caffeine. I thought that it was such an odd question. I told him that I drank coffee sometimes, but that it wasn't a problem. He continued to examine my breasts and asked me how many cups a day would I say. Well, just a few, I said, and then began to think. I guess about 3 cups in the morning, and then 1 for the road, 1 to start the day at work, and then several coffee breaks. We usually have a couple of cups after lunch, and then 1 for the road on the way home. I usually make an after-dinner pot, but that's about it. I wanted him to tell me that it was normal. I don't know why, but for the first time since I started drinking coffee, I felt really ashamed. He grabbed my hand and placed it on my own breast. Do you feel these lumps? I felt around, and sure enough, there were too many lumps to count. My heart started pounding as the thought of cancer pounded through me. Almost as if he could read my mind, he said, They are not cancerous, but you are far from healthy. These lumps are the result of an overconsumption of the drug caffeine. It was the first time that I had heard the word drug used to refer to caffeine. He continued to question me about my general mood. Did I suffer from regular mood swings? Yes. Did I suffer from regular headaches? Yes, all the time. Did I suffer from feelings of lethargy? Yes, all the time. Did I find it hard to concentrate, feel fidgety, or suffer from a short temper? Yes, yes, yes. By the end of the visit, Dr. H had officially diagnosed me with an addiction to caffeine. His advice was to reduce to 1 or 2 cups a day if I had to have some. The cigarettes had to go. I felt as if I had been hit by a truck. Couldn't he just write out a prescription and be done with it? Wasn't there some sort of magical cure to bring me back to where I was before the student teaching? I could live without coffee. How did I get into this mess in the first place? I told myself that it wasn't a big deal after all. Until that visit, I never really felt that I had a problem. On the drive home, I got out a cigarette, lit up, and started puffing away while I pulled into the first Starbucks that I saw. I ordered my usual, walked away, and it hit me. I didn't even really want coffee. I hadn't even thought about it. It was just a part of me now, like waking up in the morning or falling asleep at night. My heart sank again as I realized that I was an addict. When I got home, I went straight to bed. I didn't want my mom to know what the doctor had said. I didn't want to deal with her. I could just quit. Just thinking about it made me happy. That was it. I would quit. I was so high on this idea that I wanted to make a pot of coffee. I would quit the next day. Downstairs, my mom said that if I was sick, I really shouldn't be drinking coffee. Well, I wasn't sick, I told her. The doctor said that I was fine and that I could just use some R&R. Next day, I woke up and didn't have to go to work. Great. I thought that I could sleep in and then go for a bike ride. It had been so long since I'd ridden my bike. I looked in the mirror. I had put on weight, lost muscle tone. This made me feel very low. Downstairs, I got the coffee out, ready to make a pot. Then it hit me. Today is my quitting day. So I was good for the first morning. I walked around in a daze, forgetting what I had planned to do. Oh yeah, a bike ride, I thought. I went out to get my bike. The tires were flat. Oh no, I thought. I pumped up the tires and then took off. After 10 minutes, I felt a burning sensation in my lungs. I had to stop. After I caught my breath, I started out again, but I felt bad. Cycling used to be so enjoyable. My head started hurt and then it started to pound. I couldn't really see straight. I passed a Starbucks and could smell the intoxicating aroma on the street. I couldn't resist. I walked inside and ordered the usual. After 3 of the usual, my headache was gone. I cycled home and just watched TV. By dinner, I was in the worst of moods. I couldn't take it, and so I made my coffee pot. It was official. I had a problem. Over dinner, I decided to confess to my mom what the doctor had told me. I told her everything that was on my mind. I told her how I felt angry all the time and tired and physically ill. All the while, she listened patiently. She didn't nag me at all or say that she told me so. She was wonderful. She made me a cup of herbal tea, caffeine-free, and we drank tea together. In that moment, she reminded me of Mrs. Anderson during that first week of student teaching. I remembered how good it felt to be so honest about my weaknesses and to have someone wiser listen with an open mind. I remember how wonderful it had felt to be at the beginning of something great. Then I started to talk openly to my mom about where I began to go wrong. It was clear to me that I needed to change direction. I needed to get healthy again for the sake of my career and my overall well-being. In the end, I won. I gave up coffee and cigarettes. It wasn't easy. It took the help of everyone around me. I had to be honest with myself about the addiction. I started to research caffeine addiction to understand how it works. I started to read up on what caffeine was doing to my body and my mind. Gave myself reasonable benchmarks. For the first month, I could have 3 solid cups a day, one after each meal. When I wanted more, I either drank water or went for a bike ride. Sometimes I did both. By month 2, I'd cut out the after-dinner coffee. That was hard. I had to switch to caffeine-free herbal tea and lots of water. Gradually, I started to get my energy back and feel in control of my life again. Coffee slowly became something that I could control as opposed to something that controlled me. What I really had to examine was my emotional dependence on caffeine. I started drinking coffee at the point of weakness in my life and had grown to rely on it as a crutch. Having discovered this, I needed to come up with an alternative method for dealing with my stress. I thought about my mom and Mrs. Anderson. They had both helped me out through 2 critical points in my life. Coffee both began and ended with that. I realized that it was my weakness that led me to addiction, but it was my strength that led me to recovery.
And that is the 9th confession, hooked by design. I keep coming back to that phrase because I think it's the most honest way to describe what happened to her and what's happening to millions of people right now who have no idea it's even happening. She didn't go looking for an addiction. She went looking for a teaching job. She wanted to make a difference in kids' lives. She had a plan. She had a purpose. And somewhere between the first cup in that messy classroom and the third pot at 2 in the morning, she lost the thread completely. And here's the part that nobody wants to talk about. It wasn't her fault. I'm not saying that to let anyone off the hook. Personal responsibility matters. But when every single space you occupy, your workplace, your school, your social circle, your street corner, is handing you the same substance and calling it normal, calling it productivity, calling it community, how are you supposed to see it for what it really is? That's the society trap. That's the design. And the scariest part, it doesn't start with cravings. It doesn't start with withdrawal. It starts with someone you trust handing you something warm and saying, "Here, this will help." She believed them. Most of us do. What got me about this confession, what really stopped me, was the moment in the doctor's office. She listed off her daily intake like it was nothing. 3 cups in the morning, 1 for the road, several coffee breaks, a couple after lunch, an after dinner pot. And when she finished, she said she wanted him to tell her it was normal. She needed someone to tell her it was normal because that's what this addiction does. It makes you need the world to validate it because if it's normal, you don't have to change. If everyone's doing it, you're not the problem. But then he placed her hand on her own breast and she felt the lumps and the word drug came out of his mouth for the first time. And in that moment, everything she had been telling herself fell apart. That's the wake up call most of us are waiting for. But here's what I want to leave you with today. You don't have to wait for that moment. You don't have to wait until your body forces the conversation your mind keeps avoiding. You can start asking the questions right now. How much are you really consuming? What are you feeling when you don't have it? What are you not feeling because you always do? She got out, slowly, imperfectly, with the help of her mother and a bike and a box of herbal tea. She got out, and she said something at the end of her story that I think is worth repeating. Her weakness led her to addiction. Her strength led her to recovery. That's it. That's the whole thing right there. You have that same strength. I genuinely believe that. If this confession resonated with you, share it. Tag someone who needs to hear this today. Leave us a review on whatever platform you're listening on. It means more than you know, and it helps us reach the people who need these stories most. And if you have your own confession, your own moment where caffeine took something from you, we want to hear it. Go to the link in the show notes. Your story could be the one that wakes someone else up. Until next time, stay free, stay clear, stay unwired. If you made it this far into The Truth About Caffeine, you already know this isn't just about coffee. It's about your nervous system, your sleep, your anxiety, and your life. If you don't want to do this alone, that's why I built Unwired. Inside the Unwired app, you can log your last caffeine use, track withdrawals, sleep, mood, and energy over days and weeks. See your own nervous system reset instead of hoping it's working, and get matched with a coach for one-on-one training so you're not white-knuckling this by yourself. Alongside that, the Unwired podcast walks through 40 real caffeine case studies, people who went from just coffee to energy drinks and pills, and then back out. You'll hear their mistakes, relapses, and what actually worked. Both links are at the top of the description. Join the Unwired app waitlist for coaching and tracking. Listen to the Unwired podcast. Save this audiobook, send it to one person who needs it, and if you're stuck in that daily 2 p.m. crash, come do this with us inside Unwired, not just in your head.